Welcome everybody to the discussion session. First of all, couple of points. The most important, please leave any feedback you have in the Blackboard we have on the left-hand side. And second, feel free to interact in as many different ways as you can think of. So raise your hand, shout in a civil way, or just have the question appear and upvote them. So we'll be democratic and start with the first one, and then depending on the nice narrative, I hope. And I would say the underlying question is it really having these deep neural networks a manner to tackle the complexity, sacrificing possibly
Okay, I'm ready to defer to my senior colleagues here. I would say I was trained as a scientist. I'm now closer to engineering, and I think the engineering community, I think they've been okay with fitting 17th degree polynomials to a reactor is going to match. So I think interpretability, it depends. This whole science editorial about the black box back, I think it's in the eyes of the beholder. We're a scientist, definitely looking for making hypotheses, by coming up with no hypotheses. Engineers as designers, maybe we can live a little bit more knowledge because the tools work. I think, at the very least, Bayesian, the uncertainty quantification, that's definitely important. Knowing whether the model is or not, I would say that is, as far as I'm concerned, able to know, right? Totally outside science.
I would agree. And I think the only caveat that we have to understand where those methods work, where they don't, and find with the method. So there's a certain domain where it works, find to use it. So I think it's perfectly fine to use those black box methods as while we know where these methods works and where it don't work, and just to be careful.
Karsten, add?
You also said, I think it's a question of what is the purpose with the research. I mean, a computational screening where you're really interested in the result, and afterwards you use the machine to get some ideas, and then you confirm it somehow afterwards. And I think maybe you will not require so much understanding. On the other hand, if you are after scientific understanding, I mean,
so let's move more towards an application side, and all of you are going or have presented generative models. And I was flattered by the fact that string descriptors, text, grammar actually works possibly better, or it's more apt to tackle the generative problem with respect to, for example, a 3D descriptor. This notwithstanding, the first glance one can think this as more information somehow. What is your thought on this?
Well, I think, I mean, with the more, say, simpler descriptions of molecules, so simpler to predict the molecules just from the different components. But in fact, if you want to predict the coordinates, like having effectively a force field, which is simply just complicated. So I think it's of course preferable if we could also predict the actual structures in space, but still don't have approaches where we can do that in general. Molecular units capture the structure also.
have very strong and very unpopular opinion on that. So, well, first of all, the string, like a character-based methods and generative, are extremely successful because this field, the generative model for sequences is so much more developed than other methods. That's why it's successful. We just hijack them from essentially NLP field. Now, the question about the grammar, I think there is an unhealthy obsession in the field. The percentage of validity of your molecules. And my unpopular opinion, just put a filter and then you have always 100%. I think this is not a problem.
Rafa, any thought?
Yeah, I mean, this came up yesterday when I was talking about this. In a sense, where the grammar, you're putting the filter inside the end-to-end learning, outside as a cutoff, as a pass-through. I think it feels more learning, first principally, put it inside the end-to-end learning of the CS oriented. For the engineering, this is again, if you're just thinking application-based, takes a millisecond to filter them out, you might as well filter them later, right? Like, we can spare that millisecond. CPU with RDKit rather than the GPU with a grammar. And then absolutely concur on the hijacking the string toolset. It's a combination of the string toolset and having come around with a smiles. It's a 1980s notation that contains the molecular graph with some exceptions. There are rotamers, there are a few things. And anybody interested in organic metal complexes is out of luck because they definitely don't work in smiles. So it has flaws, but A, it contains a full graph. B, through canonicalization, it sorts out a lot of the problems that comes from graph, right? Permutation, symmetry, right? This is an issue, and we've sorted it out for input. We can input graphs to a neural network fine, but we haven't sorted it out for outputs, right? When we're writing graphs out, pairing graphs, and that means graph isomorphism. So in a sense, coming in, I think graphs and strings are pretty much equivalent. They can be converted into each other. It's clear. I think coming out, the strings are just easier to write because we can borrow rather than steal the tools from the NLP community. And then on the 2D, 3D conversation, I think it's important to keep in mind that it depends on what it's trying to do. Trying to propagate dynamics, that's a 3D problem that needs a 3D representation. But if you're doing molecular or crystal design, in a crystal you would be designing a type and occupancies. Molecules you would be designing a graph. And the 3D manifold emerges from the graph, right? There is only one 3D manifold graph. Putting graph smiles as the input. If you're putting the 3D coordinates, somehow using physics, guess what the 3D coordinates are, and then assuming that the graph is connected to that sort of bijectively, but it's only one way. So it's a place where I think the community is using blurred lines.
I guess this brings us to a question about the practicality of transferring generatively designed molecules to commercial application, and also if synthesizability is actually possibly encoded in this generative model. We have been at Philippe's presentation at IBM about retrosynthesis.
No, I think it's extremely important to have this safety check and this reality check, because we can generate, craziest molecules, 6 oxygen in the row, and then you show it to a real chemist and say, Jesus, this is total crap, right? So I think it's extremely important to, to develop those methods and maybe couple them. And, there are a few things we do in my lab and other people labs. So I think it's a healthy growing field.
I mean, we're only in the beginning of this. So I mean, it's develop, try out. It's too early to.
Said industrial in the question, right?
There is also commercial. One of those questions you cannot see.
I mean, moving a compound to market is a lot of outer optimization. Pharma, very big win. Sorry. Thank you. I was saying that in pharma, it's a big win to come up with a new compound that does something. Pretty much, if you address some disease, that's definitely a product. But the hoops one needs to go through are completely outside what we simulate and somewhat outside what we machine learn on. Much of that data is private. There isn't really that much. Only 1,000 molecules have been approved to be used as drugs. So it's not like we've got, it's too little for a neural network anyway to predict human toxicity because there's only 1,000 inputs. So moving into practice is a big issue. I've said this before, right? I put the Rob Lowe quote. Maybe leads, coming up with leads wasn't the problem in the first place, like spamming like 1,000 options. Maybe it's more valuable to come up with like, we were chatting about yesterday, maybe to propose 3 options or 2 options to the experimentalist, right? Like give them really curated choices. And I think that's sort of what the field, we need to think about what other filters will connect to actual application. With materials, it's even more tricky because the business case is usually more difficult. Right? Like perovskite, organic photovoltaic. It's not even clear if there is a market. Takes in the way there is market drugs. So it's more tiers of optimization that aren't really represented. And maybe coupling to autonomous experimentation is a way to sort of loop that.
You're reminding me to keep the microphones as closer as we can to our mouths again. And I guess this also brings to a benchmarking issue. We have heard a lot about reproducibility yesterday and how benchmarking and sharing is important. Being so new, how do you benchmark if generative models?
What's the task?
Like, is there a way to demonstrate that your generative model is better, is working, is not giving, is just the counterfactual reality of finding something new and good, or?
Well, I mean, depending, I mean, been looking at, you sort of have your training set is a computational set, and therefore you can also, when you make predictions, you can do the same computations and test if they actually weigh what you expect. But of course, it doesn't mean that they can be applied for a particular purpose. But within its own little world, you can see that the machine actually does what it's.
So testing those methods are hard because different people use them for absolutely different purpose. And so far what we've been doing, you test for, I don't know, local P diversity. There are a few things that, yes, we can compare methods. However, the problem is that if you come up with a new drug, it doesn't matter how diverse your generative model. As soon as you come up with just one molecule and it does the job, who cares what's the diversity, right? So it's really hard to benchmark, universally. But what I would think that makes sense is to, maybe do a more case specific, depending on what the purpose of the application. But so far, those has not been crystallized yet. We'll see, what's happened next couple of years.
Rafa, if you want to add anything. Then I guess we can move towards a more, again, physics-based, math-based question, which is about latent spaces. or data topology. We have heard the talk of Michele this morning about intrinsic dimensionality. Also, Volken Turk was explicitly describing this latent space. Can we move towards the understanding in this context of data topology, which is booming? Math is already a great application in physics.
I think this is a very exciting topic, but again, I think we're so far we're only scratching the surface of this. It's and as far as I know, I mean, it's not just within physics or chemistry that you have this really understanding structure of data and latent spaces. So I think we have a lot to see there, but I don't think we are very far yet. There are contributions.
It's still a very difficult problem, right? We took discrete structure and sent it to a 450 dimensional space, gigantic. So we will still have big challenges. I think Karsten said, just the beginning of how to look into these problems. I think disentanglement in variational autoencoders is something that's very interesting. Try to assign, and in the spirit of interpretability, trying to see what the machine learned dimension is supposed to mean. That's one direction that's increasingly interesting. Try to tie the dimensions with things that we can interpret or understand. But still, it's very complex spaces anyway. And in molecules, particularly when we're mixing supervised and unsupervised, the spaces are really, really jagged, right? They're very valleys, peaks. It's not a smooth space to move around. And that's why maybe some of the translation approaches have worked so well for molecular optimization, but also for synthesis. I don't know if we've had our IBM fellows around here, but they've done a very difficult task, very simple, by casting it into a translation problem. So you only move locally to avoid these very complex high-dimensional surfaces, many voids, right? There are empty spaces that maybe we can never fill over 450 dimensions.
Expand a bit more. I mean, the reason that I think it's exciting, of course, is that it gives I mean, much theory is formulated in terms of collective variables. I mean, this could actually give the chance, as we also saw in the talk today, to connect all these, the data, detailed data, with a theory and therefore an understanding of phenomena. That would be fantastic progress in terms of understanding what it was. And where it would be also a tool for actually discovering new collective variables.
Then I guess we can do a step back to more simple approaches to the subject. And trending question is about the most common error or the more common errors that you observe to approaching the field. Can you comment on that?
I've got a pet peeve with not doing nearest neighbor. You're training something. We tend to see these folks cooking their training data. No, you really need one of each of these classes in your training so that then it validates well. And if you find yourself doing that, check against nearest neighbor. Because if your system is sort of just learning that there is, for every A, there is an A prime that is really close. So as long as I train in that way where all the A's are present, the primes will be learnable. I think that's sort of the number one, being honest about sort of the Jacob ladder of statistical methods. And I think PyTorch, Keras, we've got these big engines that eat up data, and it's very tempting to just throw the biggest tool from the beginning. But, well, we lose the interpretability, but we also sort of lose the statistical complexity of what we're doing. And I say, it's clear that neural networks will do better for many tasks, and of course, that's what we're all trying to do. But I think it makes sense to tier a little bit the approaches, or at least to show that the dumbest thing is not better than your approach. I think that would be my pet peeve, to make sure that your nearest neighbor is worse than the method that you trained.
I think it's basically the same advice. Try simpler models first. Kind of correlations do you actually have in your data before much more fancy? Because also, if you have a simpler model, you might actually be able to interpret much more easily. It might be that the more sophisticated model is a little bit more accurate.
Absolutely agree. That's for sure. I can add that, knowledge of basic statistics, and we have to, as the community or communities, educate, don't test on your training data and claim victory and 99% accuracy models. It's always nice to have. The issue of quality of data, if you get your simulation data, it's mostly clean and noise-free, but if you deal with experimental data, you're looking for data quality errors and, errors propagation from, copying different databases or, text mining. That's actually an issue. And, if you put some dirty data in, you'll get a garbage model out. It's also an important problem to keep in mind.
And I think this brings us to the next question, which is about data sharing, but also data ownership. And I guess you're for sure one of the representatives. Material Genome, many other projects also here in Europe. Are we going to have a unique platform open for all? Is this a strategic ownership that each country needs to develop?
Well, data is new oil, right? So it's actually, all those startups and big tech companies, actually, if you see, they happy share models, but Google would never share data with you. So data in many respects is the most precious things. I think it's for a community and the spirit of open science collaboration. We do have to share data, and for example, in my lab and many other labs, so we share most of or all of the data and models open. I think there will be never one kind of gigantic pile. It never works because data is extremely heterogeneous. If this format works for me, will never work for you or for your types of simulations. So it's nice to have a lot of those repositories. However, the problem is how to merge and harmonize those data, and the issue of heterogeneity of data, different methods of simulations. It's one of the hardest problem to learn in data, data realm.
But if you sort of limit this to say computationally generated data like what you structure code, I think we already have quite a few data repositories around the world. I'm not sure that I mean, there is one like Nomad, which sort of just takes in all kinds of data, and where there have been attempts also to make conversions from many different codes into a standard format. And I think this could be very useful, but also that still as long as the data is open in a clear format, I don't think that putting it into a common database is that important. Another point is that the computations become faster and faster because new algorithms are developed and computers become faster and so on. And to some extent, sharing, if you like, methods and codes to generate the data is also very important. What we maybe consider today a very important database might actually be something that you in, say, 5 or 10 years could easily generate if you just had the code. So in that sense, I think it's not only the data, but it's also very much sharing the codes and also the the workflows necessary to generate codes, which also by themselves would be a kind of documentation for computational data.
That was a very good argument about codes. And it seems doable, I think, to centralize formats, exchange. There was this big push in chemistry with the XML, sort of a chemical markup language, sort of took off, but never really popularized as much. But the incentive system is also strange, right? Because there are more incentives to start a repository than to maintain a repository. So we end up with this jungle of one group repositories. I think Nomad is a very good exception where there is a big community behind it. But in general, there is an array of places to put your data, an array of workflows, which to some degree are used by the community that makes them. And I think the barrier is sort of reaching out to the rest of the community. That means writing documentation, having someone on staff to answer queries by users, and that means that salaries need to get paid, and there isn't really a funding structure to maintain repositories that would allow to do that. And then there is the incentive of releasing data, which being the new oil. I think folks are okay to release the data once it's exhausted. I don't think anybody would release the data before they've sort of extracted as much value as possible. Because again, the incentives for people are to invent and to develop new stuff. So there is sort of a first mover advantage there that pushes against releasing. With the code is different, right? Like you put the code out and the usefulness of code is measured by people using it, but the usefulness of data is measured by sort of what one makes out of it. So yeah, I don't think we're going to see a centralized. We've never seen a centralized anything. Right, maybe PDB. I think the biology community, the big data biology community, has things to teach there. Because right, there's big user bases, there's very intuitive interfaces, there's a broad community of folks that know how to ask questions even if they're not experts. So there's probably lessons to be learned there. And then if we move into, particularly for materials, experimental data, then it's all the challenges we've mentioned, plus noise, right? It's very noisy, small data sets, just curating them, putting them in the same format, fixing all the errors. It becomes more and more complicated. So I think there's this balance. I don't think there is an answer. You know what, yes, everybody gives their Citrine, right? Citrine has this monstrous heterogeneous database, which I think is usable by the people who know what they put in there, but unless you're somebody that contributed in some way, it's really, really difficult to make use of such a large heterogeneous data, unlike maybe in the biology community.
I think there's quite a push for computational data published quickly. So I think this sitting on the data until you get everything out of it, I think that's disappearing. Generate useful data sets, they make a publication, but in connection with that publication, it's getting it's a bad style if you don't make your data also available. I think that's very useful because, in fact, of course, further research can then be done on the data set, and that's often very valuable.
And I hope to wrap up maybe with a bit of a self-referential question. We have seen a lot of many different work applying machine learning in many different landscapes and problems. Do you reckon that this will create a heterogeneous community that will continue to thrive because of the interfacing, or at some point each of these will define this, will set up the standard and improve itself only for a particular machine learning application? Or to wrap it up, do you get a feeling of where the many fields are moving forward?
It's an exciting time to be alive, right? Like there is this seemingly magical tools that everybody can make use of and everybody can make contributions to some degree, although obviously it's pushed by the computer science people. I would say at my home institution, right, there is going to be this philanthropy effort to start a college of computing. So MIT is going to create a structure, and the idea is to have everybody be bilingual in whatever they do, and algorithmic thinking, let's call it, this sort of data-driven computational toolset. That's the view today, right? We're all very excited. It's been 4.5 years. It's a very short period, very promising results, but of course the jury is out there, right? I think we will need to see this grow for a couple more years before we realize if the world has changed for good or it's just a phase and go to somewhere else.
Well, as you said, I mean, we see lots of efforts now within physics. I think it's not going to go away, but probably it'll get to another level where it's sort of standard tools that people will know about and that they will use in the places where it's actually properly used. So it's probably right now there are so many investigations because where it can be applied. A phase that we will go beyond, and then it'll continue, of course, but at a different level.
Yeah, and the use of those tools is, is going to be yet another, tool set in our toolbox. And, first of all, we have to be careful not to overpromise and under-deliver. But besides for that, it's going to be a lot of communities, and there are still branches of science where machine learning is not there yet. And you'll see probably the propagation of those algorithms into those new domains. So it's going to be probably many more communities being served.
And so I hope that this gives you a wide overview about the thoughts of our invited speakers on generative models, machine learning, and where the different fields in physics are moving forward, and the importance of data. And they will be available for discussion, and I will close, however, the public discussion session here. Thank you very much, everybody.